For more than 2 decades in the United States Senate, one name kept coming up whenever people talked about Washington's most enduring mysteries: Lindsey Graham. Not because of a scandal, and not because of some secret romance uncovered by a tabloid. It was something much simpler and much harder for the political press to leave alone. He was the only senator of his era who had never married, never had children, and never gave a straight answer about why. For nearly 50 years, he deflected the question with a joke. Then, within days of his sudden death at 71, his only sibling finally gave the world the real answer. And it turned out to be one of the most quietly moving stories in modern American politics. Lindsey Olin Graham was born on July 9, 1955, in central South Carolina, a small mill town where his parents ran a restaurant, pool hall, bar, and liquor store. The family didn't live in a separate house at first. They lived in a single room behind the business, sharing a bathroom with the mill workers who came in for a drink after their shifts. It was a hard, unglamorous childhood, and Graham would later write about it candidly in his own memoir, describing baths taken in a washtub and a checkers set on the bar as make-believe entertainment. He became the first person in his family to go to college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina with plans that had nothing to do with the United States Senate. Those plans were interrupted by tragedy before he had even finished his degree. When Graham was 21 years old, his mother, Millie, died of Hodgkin's lymphoma. 15 months later, his father, Florence James Graham, known to everyone as FJ, died suddenly of a heart attack. In the space of little more than a year, Graham had lost both parents, and he was left responsible for his younger sister, Darlene, who was still a young teenager. There was no wealthy relative ready to step in. There was no extended family structure built to absorb a grieving teenage girl. There was only a college student, barely into his 20s, who decided he was not going to let his sister be scattered off to distant relatives. He made regular trips back and forth between his classes in Columbia and the town where Darlene was being looked after, determined to stay involved in her life no matter what it cost him personally. According to Darlene's own later recollections, he made her a promise in those early days that he would always be there for her and would always take care of her. He spent the rest of his life keeping it. Graham didn't just check in on his sister from a distance. He became her legal guardian while he was still in school himself. And after he enrolled in the Air Force's Judge Advocate General's Corps and began active duty, he took the extraordinary step of legally adopting her. The adoption wasn't a symbolic gesture. It meant Darlene could be covered under his military health and family benefits, something a guardianship alone would not have guaranteed. In practical terms, a man in his 20s, still building a legal career in uniform, became a full-time parent to a teenager who had just lost everyone else. Balancing that responsibility with law school and, later, a career as a military prosecutor and defense attorney was not easy, especially once Graham was stationed overseas at an Air Force base in Germany during the final years of his active duty. Raising a teenager from another continent meant leaning on a small circle of family friends back in Central to help fill in the gaps, and making the trip home whenever he could to check on her schooling and her well-being. Darlene has said she never felt like she lacked for structure, crediting her brother's insistence on staying present even when the miles between them made it difficult. He was, by her own description, protective almost to a fault. In campaign appearances years later, she would joke about how strict he had been, saying he never let her date, that he would smell her clothes to check if she had been smoking, and that he listened in on her phone calls. Underneath the humor was something plainer. A young man who had taken full responsibility for another human being and treated it as the most important job he would ever have. Friends from that era have described watching Graham grow up almost overnight, trading the ordinary freedoms of a college student for the daily obligations of a guardian. He carried that same sense of duty into every job that followed, from the courtroom to the campaign trail, and colleagues who worked alongside him decades later still pointed back to those years as the explanation for his instincts as a legislator: a preference for practical solutions over ideological purity, and a tendency to treat obligations, once made, as permanent. After finishing his law degree at the University of South Carolina, Graham entered active duty with the Air Force's Judge Advocate General's Corps in 1982, working first as a prosecutor and later as a defense attorney, experience that took him overseas to a base in Germany during the final stretch of his active service. He would go on to spend 33 years in uniform between active duty and the Air Force Reserve, retiring as a colonel in 2015, a parallel career that ran alongside his rise from local prosecutor to United States Senator and gave him a depth of first-hand military knowledge that few of his Senate colleagues could match. That military background became the foundation of his identity in Washington. He built a reputation as one of the chamber's most reliable national security hawks, someone who preferred to see conditions on the ground for himself rather than rely solely on intelligence briefings delivered secondhand. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, he made repeated trips to meet with American troops, diplomats, and allied officials, visits that shaped the positions he brought back to Senate hearings and floor speeches. That same instinct carried into his final years in office, when he became one of the most visible congressional advocates for continued American support to Ukraine following Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, arguing in speech after speech that helping Ukraine defend itself was not charity, but a direct investment in international stability. He was returning from one such trip to Kyiv in the days before his death. That early responsibility shaped the rest of Graham's personal life in a way that rarely made it into the political coverage of his career. While his peers were dating and starting families of their own in their 20s and 30s, Graham was finishing law school, building a career in the Air Force Reserve, and making sure his sister had what she needed. By the time Darlene was grown and independent, Graham had moved from local legal jobs in South Carolina into elected office, first winning a seat in the state legislature in 1992, then the U.S. House in 1994, and finally the U.S. Senate in 2002, where he succeeded the long-serving Strom Thurmond. His Senate career became defined by a willingness to work across the aisle, sometimes to the fury of his own party. He partnered with the late Senator Ted Kennedy on comprehensive immigration reform in the mid-2000s, and later became one of the central figures in the Senate's bipartisan Gang of Eight that tried again in 2013, a coalition that spent months negotiating a bill combining stronger border enforcement with a lengthy path to legal status for undocumented immigrants already in the country. The bill passed the Senate but died in the House. Both efforts drew heavy criticism from conservative activists who saw any path to legal status as amnesty, but Graham argued publicly that border security and an orderly immigration system were not opposing goals, and that the two had to be built together or not at all. He also built one of the closest friendships in Washington with the late Senator John McCain, alongside Senator Joe Lieberman, the three of them earning the nickname the Three Amigos for their work on defense and foreign policy. McCain used to joke publicly that he had watched Graham date plenty of women over the years, but had never once seen him get close to a wedding, a line the two men traded back and forth for years without either treating it as anything more than affectionate ribbing. When McCain was diagnosed with brain cancer in 2017, it was Graham who told fellow senators the news after speaking with him directly by phone. After McCain's death in 2018, Graham remained close to the family, a bond Meghan McCain later described as something that made him feel like an extension of their own household, one that lasted right up until his own final days. Graham's relationship with Donald Trump went through one of the more striking transformations in recent Republican politics. During the 2016 primary, he was among Trump's sharpest critics, at one point calling him a bigot after Trump proposed banning Muslim immigrants, a comment that led Trump to read Graham's personal cell phone number aloud at a campaign rally. In the years after McCain's death, Graham became one of Trump's most reliable allies in the Senate, chairing the Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2021 and later the Budget Committee starting in 2025. He remained active on foreign policy until the very end of his life, making repeated trips to Ukraine as one of the strongest congressional voices for continued American support after Russia's 2022 invasion, and traveling frequently to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Israel over the course of his career to see conditions on the ground for himself rather than relying only on briefings back in Washington. Throughout all of it, one question followed him more than any policy fight ever did. During his brief run for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination, reporters repeatedly asked who would serve as First Lady if he won. Graham, never one to get defensive, would laugh it off, once suggesting to ABC News that he might have a rotating First Lady, and that his sister and friends could fill the role when needed. It became a running joke on the campaign trail, one Darlene herself was often part of, appearing at his events and introducing him to crowds, including the day he announced his candidacy in his hometown of Central in June 2015 with his sister standing beside him. Lindsey Graham won his primary for a fifth Senate term just weeks before his death, running with President Trump's full endorsement and appearing, by all outward signs, to be as active as ever. He had just returned from a trip to Ukraine, meeting with government officials there as he had done many times before, and he had a high-profile media appearance scheduled for the very week he died. On the night of July 11th, 2026, he died suddenly at 71. His office initially described it only as a brief and sudden illness. A preliminary examination from the District of Columbia Medical Examiner's Office later pointed to an aortic dissection connected to hardened arteries, a condition that can build silently for years with no outward warning before becoming fatal in a matter of hours. President Trump said he had spoken with Graham by phone that same evening, just hours before his death, later telling reporters it may have been their last conversation and that Graham had seemed tired but otherwise fine. Tributes followed almost immediately from across the political spectrum, an unusually broad response for a senator who had spent much of his career taking positions that frustrated both parties at different times. Members of the McCain family spoke of him as someone who had felt like part of their own household for nearly 3 decades. Colleagues on both sides of the aisle pointed to his decades of military service, his role on national security committees, and his willingness to negotiate even when it cost him politically. Amid the flood of official statements, it was Darlene, now known publicly as Darlene Graham Nordon, who offered the most personal account of who her brother really was. Now a mother of 2, working in a career helping people with disabilities find employment, she has spoken about her brother in terms that go well beyond politics, describing him as something closer to a parent than a sibling, saying he was like a brother, a father, and a mother all rolled into one. She has recalled that in the earliest days after their parents' deaths, he wrapped his arms around her and promised he would always be there and always take care of her, a promise she says he never once treated as a burden for the rest of his life. When asked directly why he never married, her answer was plain and unsentimental. She explained that he was a young man taking on a young girl, and then a teenager, to raise, all while trying to finish his own education, and that there simply was not enough time in a day for much else. It wasn't a hidden wound or a private heartbreak he carried silently for 50 years. It was a choice, made deliberately in his early 20s, to put his sister first, and one he never publicly treated as a sacrifice worth resenting. Graham himself touched on the subject in his own 2015 memoir, writing that he had never married and attributing it partly to timing, joking that the right opportunity, or the right person, never quite lined up, before adding, more sincerely, that he considered himself a man with a family all the same. In a fitting final chapter, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster appointed Darlene to serve out the remainder of her brother's Senate term, at President Trump's recommendation. She was sworn in under her legal name, Darlene Graham, and has since announced she will run for a full 6-year term in the seat, encouraged by the same president who had spent years as her brother's closest political ally. Her decision set off a competitive Republican primary field, with other South Carolina Republicans, including Representative Ralph Norman, also entering the race for the seat once held by her brother. Funeral services for Lindsey Graham were held in 2 stages roughly 2 weeks after his death. In Washington, his remains were carried into the Capitol Rotunda by an armed forces body-bearer team in recognition of his more than 3 decades of military service, followed by a funeral at Washington National Cathedral, the same church that has hosted services for other major American political figures. President Trump delivered a tribute at that service, which was closed to the public but streamed for anyone who wanted to watch. His remains were then flown to South Carolina, where the following day brought a public procession at the State House in Columbia, an F-16 flyover from a South Carolina Air National Guard unit in honor of his Air Force career, and a funeral service at First Baptist Church of Columbia before a private family burial in his native Pickens County, the same corner of the state where he grew up behind his parents' bar and where he and Darlene had once stood together at their parents' graves. What Darlene's account ultimately reveals is not a hidden scandal or a secret relationship kept from public view. It is something plainer, and in its own way, more affecting. Lindsey Graham never married because he had already built a family decades earlier, the day he decided that raising his sister mattered more than anything else he might have wanted for himself. Every joke about a rotating first lady, every deflection in a campaign interview, sat quietly on top of that original decision, One his sister only spelled out in full after the country had already lost him, and one she is now carrying forward in the same Senate seat where he spent nearly a quarter of a century keeping the promise he made to her as a grieving college student, more than 50 years before. Political obituaries tend to measure a senator's life in committee chairmanships, landmark votes, and the shape of the party he leaves behind, and Graham's will include all of that. 2 decades on the Judiciary and Armed Services Committees, a leading role in confirming a long line of federal judges, a hand in immigration fights that never quite reached the finish line, and a late-career transformation from one of Donald Trump's harshest critics into one of his most trusted allies. But colleagues who knew him well have consistently pointed to something else when asked to describe the man rather than the senator. And it is the same thing his sister has spent the past 2 weeks describing to reporters across the country. Long before he cast his first vote or delivered his first floor speech, Lindsey Graham had already made the decision that would define him. At 21, with both parents gone and a grieving younger sister in his care, he chose responsibility over freedom, and he never seems to have looked back or treated it as a loss. That choice explains the decades of jokes about bachelorhood that followed him through 3 presidential election cycles and countless newspaper profiles. It explains why, when reporters pressed him during his 2016 campaign about who would stand beside him if he reached the White House, he could laugh off the question rather than flinch from it, because the honest answer had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. He already had a family. It simply did not look like the one voters expected a presidential candidate to have. It also explains why, in the final accounting of his life, the person most qualified to speak to who he really was turned out to be neither a Senate colleague nor a longtime aide, but the sister he raised. Darlene Graham Nordon's account did not surface because a tabloid finally cracked a decades-old secret. It surfaced because, for the first time, someone asked her directly, and she answered plainly, the way she has apparently been prepared to answer for most of her adult life. Her brother never married because he had already spent himself, gladly, keeping a promise made in the rooms behind a small-town South Carolina bar, to a frightened 11-year-old who had just lost everything and needed someone to tell her it would be all right. He told her he would take care of her. For nearly 50 years, in Washington and everywhere else, that is exactly what he did.